The Independent Electoral Commission today briefed the Portfolio Committee on Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs about some proposals around the e-voting system for South Africa. Well, here in studio to discuss this with me is the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa's founder, Tselane. Mrs. Tselane, very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. Well, there still has been no decision yet on whether, in fact, we should go the route of electronic voting. But of course, these conversations are continuing. And there's a couple of things that particularly caught my attention today as this matter was discussed. But I want us to first perhaps kick off by talking about both the advantages and disadvantages of electronic voting.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. Perhaps let's start with the disadvantages. Quite a number of people do not have access to electronic, or they don't have access to electronic mechanism. And as a result of that, the Commission will have to take a lot of time trying to educate people about the electronic voting system, but also to make sure that people have got access. Because as you know that South Africa has got disparities, particularly if you look in terms of urban areas and rural areas. And then that gap would obviously have to be closed. But perhaps the most important of them all is the element of trust, that the majority of people don't trust electronic machines. They believe that it is possible to preload information into the machine, and that the outcome of the results of the elections would therefore not be trusted. Those are the disadvantages. Now let's go to the advantages. Electronic voting machines, or system in particular, enhances efficiencies. It helps the organization to avoid some of the mistakes that normally happen during the voting processes. It reduces the number of spoiled ballots, but also it reduces the level of anxiety in terms of the outcome of the results of the elections, because when you have the results being produced in real time, people do not actually begin to wonder whether information is actually being manufactured or being tampered with in the background. So the fact that information is available in real time as people actually vote will actually, to a large extent, allay the fears that the majority of people may have towards the electronic voting systems.
Let's start with the technical side of it. And these are some of the things that caught my attention this morning. The IEC was talking about internet penetration, which has gone up in the country. They were talking about phones and types of phones that people have, which I think was way above 70% of the population having access to these types of gadgets that will presumably make life easy. So suggesting, in other words, that if you look at just those two, you've already gone some way in ensuring that this is actually feasible. And then when you talk about the trust issues, which I want us to stay on for quite a bit, to what extent is that trust issue being really thrust down our throats by some of the big and significant political parties? In other words, should we be held back as a country from, I'm assuming this is, everybody agrees this would be an advancement. Should we be held back by fears of political players who may have no basis or justification for their fears?
No, I think there are two issues here. One, as you correctly pointed out, that some of the political parties may want us to stick to the current system of manual system because they don't trust the system. But there is also a real problem. And that real problem is that ordinary people also don't trust the system because the system has not been socialized. In other words, we as a country have not actually gone to different places to try to educate people about the electronic voting system. So we can't just dismiss everyone and say that, they've got a political agenda, when in actual fact, it may be because of lack of knowledge. So I think our responsibility, those of us who believe in electronic voting, have got a responsibility, together with the Commission and all of the political parties and other civil society organizations, to educate people about the electronic voting system that is going to be introduced, but also to show the advantages. But in the case where there are disadvantages, like I've already indicated, we've got to be able to indicate how we're going to obviate some of those vulnerabilities that may be there in the system. Because if we don't do that, and then something happens during the elections, people will not trust the system at all. And I think after the results have actually been announced, there is a possibility that people can say that we should actually go back to the manual system. So in order for us to be able to move with speed, but also be able to carry our people with, we've got to make sure that issues that have been raised as vulnerabilities are addressed, and that we are able to move forward with the electronic voting mechanism.
But should we not then be doing that, educating people, but looking for the kinds of systems that have a lot more integrity and reliability built into them? In other words, not use the argument for not doing it, right? But actually starting to do the things you say need to be done. Because one of the fascinating things about it was the fact that you have a lot of countries, I'm not going to name the countries in case people think that we may think we are far ahead of or we are more advanced than, right? But who have embraced this, and they are doing very well, thank you very much, So should we not then be doing all these things simultaneously, but moving in a recognizable direction with all the advantages that you were talking about?
I think you are correct in terms of the way you think this issue should be handled. We have got to simultaneously, as we try to develop systems, educate people about electronic voting and try to indicate what kind of mechanism are being put in place to deal with those issues. We've got to deal with the issue of cybersecurity, some of the mechanisms that are put in place in order to make sure that there is no unfair interference with the electronic system, so that people can actually understand that whatever system that we're going to be using, it's a system that can actually be trusted. But I think the political parties themselves also have got a responsibility. They've got to begin with their own members, to educate their own members, their supporters, about advantages and disadvantages, and then what we are doing to obviate, as I've suggested, some of those disadvantages that are there. The truth of the matter is that the country is moving forward. You've already indicated that there are quite a number of other countries that have already advanced in terms of introducing electronic voting mechanisms. So we also have got the responsibility to begin to move in that direction. If you look at the tertiary institutions in South Africa, almost all of them are using electronic voting. All of them do no longer rely on manual ballots. They use electronic voting mechanism for SRC elections. So if already there is an understanding at tertiary level, the students understand throughout the country how the system that they are using operates, it should be easier for us to basically piggyback on what is already available to make sure that we can educate people about the electronic voting systems.
Well, I still think that by and large, South Africans take their cue from their respective political parties, and if their leaders could exercise more responsibility there, I think we will go very far in actually not so much influencing, but in getting people to understand both the advantages of the system and where it can take us. But one last issue, very, very briefly, Mr. Tselane. Cost has also been made a big issue. But when one looks at the kinds of amounts we've seen being mentioned in places like your state capture, a commission and everything we've seen over the years, whether you're talking about arms deals and all those things, I'm of the view that cost shouldn't be made an issue, certainly not on this one, with all the advantages we've spoken about. I don't know what your sense is.
No, in fact, manual voting is much more expensive than electronic voting. So electronic voting would obviously be expensive at the beginning, the first investment that you're going to put into the system. But from there, it's just maintenance. But if you look in terms of the expenses that you incur during manual voting, ballot papers that you've got to produce, especially the more you have now these political parties, the ballot paper is increasingly becoming longer and longer. So you need more paper to be able to produce the ballot papers. You need more people to be able to manage the system. The majority of problems with the manual system actually happen during counting, because the majority of people who are now participating there as the electoral staff, they are exhausted because they've been there for almost 2 days preparing for an election. So electronic voting, I think, is the way to go. And I think as a country, we've got to embrace it.
Tselane, founder of the Institute of Election Management Services, on the pros and cons of electronic voting, an issue that was explored once again in Parliament today. Thank you very much, sir, for coming through.